upon to like read books and stuff?
That's a very good question. A lot of hadiths in Tirmidhi, in Bukhari, in the Musnad of Ahmad are beautiful hadiths. In fact, we have the same hadith in our books. So can I spread that and post it if it has a good meaning? I have two observations here, which I learned from the scholars. Number one, you have to not be a qualified scholar, but you have to be learned to really decipher whether this hadith is giving you good content or not. Sometimes something from the outside sounds good, but you never know. There may be something hidden in it, something you're not aware of, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept, or it's questionable in our belief system. So you kind of have to be experienced in our school of thought. You have to be kind of a scholar with experience to pass that judgment. Because if you're not experienced, I can give you a hadith, oh yeah, this is a very good hadith. But then give it to a scholar will find several questionable aspects of the hadith. So just keep that in mind. That's number one. Number two, even if we assume that the hadith is not questionable, in fact the identical wording is found in our books. When you spread hadiths like that, ask the following question. Is this giving legitimacy to this book or no? In the eyes of people. Because remember, this book has some good hadiths, but it has a lot of false hadiths, questionable hadiths. By publicizing this particular source, this name, this title, are you giving it more weight? Are you giving it more legitimacy in society or no?
Yes.
If the answer is yes, and that's clear to you, then we are to avoid that, yes. And my dear brothers and sisters, every hadith that you find in other books out there, that you feel is a beautiful, wise, pleasant hadith, we have it in our sources. Go do research, pull it up from our sources, and publicize the words of the Imams, peace be upon them. Let people be familiar with the Imams. And I'll tell you something, now the other schools of thought, initially they find this shocking, but once they do research, they realize there's a lot of credibility to this idea. There's truth to it. Most of these beautiful hadiths that they took in their books, they were from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them. Because they were so disconnected from the time of the Prophet. Bukhari came 2 centuries after the Prophet. Don't think they really had a solid chain to the Prophet. There's no such thing. For 100 years the hadith was banned. Where are you getting all these direct chains to the Prophet? It's impossible. So they realize they have a crisis. The Imams are generating thousands of beautiful hadiths, and they're the descendants of the Prophet, and people are being drawn to the Ahlul Bayt. So to counter that, they took the teachings of the Imams, they reworded it a little bit, and then they added a chain to it, and they listed it in their books. A lot of it is taken from our Imams, especially those beautiful hadiths that talk about morality, decent, wonderful acts.
Did they add their own chains?
They added their own chains, yes. In fact, a lot of our scholars are doing research to pinpoint exactly which hadith was taken from our books when you do a historical analysis. Yes, a lot of the chains that they put are fabricated chains.
They didn't take the chains from our books.
No, because our narrators are Shia, they call them Rafidis, they don't accept that. And they don't want a source from the Imams. Because once you say this hadith is from Ja'far ibn Muhammad, or this Imam, or that Imam, then the people will gravitate towards those Imams. Bukhari was very meticulous to avoid the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. Remember, he lived at the time of Al-Imam Al-Jawad alayhi salam, Al-Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam. Okay, these are grandsons of the Prophet. They were scholars, they were narrators of hadith. Even Sunni scholars praise them. Bukhari does not narrate a single hadith from these Imams, even though he was a contemporary of them. Why? He has a problem with the Ahlul Bayt. He doesn't want people to gravitate towards the Ahlul Bayt. So if you find the answer is yes, you're giving legitimacy to these books, it's best to avoid it. Yes, the only time that scholars will usually cite their books is to prove an argument that we're making, right? Something about the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, the oneness of Allah, and you really want to demonstrate that point, tell them, well, see, it's even in your own books. But generally speaking, I would avoid that. Not because we want to be sectarian, but because there are a lot of problematic things in those books. Remember, last week we mentioned one. When we spoke about the hadith in which the Imam ﷺ says some people, they give preference to hadith over Qur'an. Remember the example that we shared about magic? Anyone remembers it?
About the Prophet?
About the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Qur'an says in Surah Al-Furqan, وَقَالَ الظَّالِمُونَ إِن تَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا رَجُلًا مَسْحُورًا. The Zalimeen, the oppressors, the unjust ones, they said that the Prophet is under sihr, he's under the spell of magic or black magic. And then what does Bukhari say? Bukhari says this Jewish man or this Jewish person, he put a spell on the Prophet and the Prophet became mashoor. So who do I believe? Bukhari or Quran? Quran says the oppressors say this. And Bukhari says no, it happened. Remember, Bukhari doesn't say he tried. If he said he tried, I have no problem with that. Obviously, there were a lot of people who tried to harm the Prophet. No. He said the Prophet actually went under the spell of magic. So when I propagate a book like that, that means I'm authorizing all these hadiths. Or the questionable hadiths that Aisha narrates about the Prophet. Very sensitive, details that she mentions that don't befit any person to do. The accusation against the prophets of God. We mentioned the examples last week. Prophet Musa, giving the angel of death a black eye, and so on and so forth. All these things.